Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I come from what I always thought was a close-knit family. My wife and I, both in our 40s, genuinely enjoy spending time with her siblings and parents. We drop the in-law titles because that's how close we feel. Her sisters are my sisters, her brothers are my brothers, and her parents treat us all like their children. About 10 months ago, my wife's sister, also in her 40s, married her fiancé after being together for 8 years. This man wasn't just any guy. He was exceptional in every way. He had stepped up to be the father figure her 16-year-old daughter always deserved, even formally adopting her a few weeks after the wedding. This guy was someone everyone gravitated toward. Always the first to offer help, funny, genuine, and incredibly thoughtful. He loved bringing the family together, cooking on his grills, sharing his bourbon collection. The last big gathering he hosted was for his 50th birthday. A month later, he was gone. A massive heart attack took him from us without warning. I stood with him as his groomsman at his wedding. 6 months later, in the same church, I helped carry his casket as a pallbearer. Our family was completely devastated. He had quickly become the heart of our family after joining it, and celebrating then mourning the same person in such a short span was something I wouldn't wish on anyone. He was meticulous about most things, but oddly enough, he hadn't made plans for where he wanted to be buried. A few weeks before his passing, he had a casual conversation with my mother-in-law, in her 70s, about final arrangements. She mentioned wanting to be buried in the family plot with her grandparents and parents, adding that after she and her husband passed, there would be 2 to 4 spaces available since most of her cousins had made other arrangements. He said he liked the thought of resting beside them. When he died in November, plans had to be made quickly. He passed on a Saturday, and we buried him the following Friday. On Monday, my mother-in-law received a shocking phone call from her cousin, in her 60s. Instead of offering condolences, the cousin angrily demanded to know how my mother-in-law could have buried what she called a stranger next to their grandmother. The conversation was mostly one-sided, with the cousin ranting about how wrong it was that this man was buried next to their grandmother, even mentioning she'd visited the town hall to see what could be done. My mother-in-law barely got a word in, only managing to say that he was her son, that we had just buried him, and that we didn't know what else to do. My father-in-law later told us he'd never seen his wife so angry in their 45-plus years of marriage. They decided not to tell my sister-in-law right away. She was already dealing with enough grief. A few days later, my mother-in-law got another call, this time from another cousin's wife. This woman warned my mother-in-law that the first cousin and her sister had obtained a lawyer and were planning to sue my sister-in-law to have her husband's body removed. At this point, my in-laws decided they needed to tell my sister-in-law what was happening. She was understandably angry, confused, and hurt. Legally, she was protected. She owned the plot where her husband was buried and the plot beside it. But the emotional damage was done. She couldn't understand how someone who claimed to be family could do something so cruel. My wife was one of the last to hear about the situation, not because they didn't want her to know, but because she's known for going scorched earth when someone messes with people she loves. They wanted her advice, but they were cautious. Some context: my mother-in-law's grandparents had set aside a 12-plot space in the local cemetery for their descendants. Of those 12 plots, only 5 were in use. My mother-in-law's parents, one cousin, and now my sister-in-law's husband. Each of the 5 sisters in that generation had inherited farmland, and some built houses nearby. The land itself was important. My mother-in-law and her brother owned land that they rented out for farming. Next to it was her cousin's land, accessed by the same path, the only access to the cousin's property. The path itself was owned entirely by my mother-in-law and her brother. When my wife heard the full story, she was livid. She didn't hold back her rage, declaring that if they wanted the cemetery plots so badly, they could choke on them. She suggested we should move her sister's husband, move her grandparents, and establish our own family cemetery elsewhere. Her words were harsh and direct, making it clear this wasn't about compromise but retaliation. This wasn't a retreat, it was retaliation, and my in-laws approved. What we realized later was that this move would make the majority of the remaining cemetery plots unusable. Moving my sister-in-law's husband and my mother-in-law's parents would create 3 empty plots. My sister-in-law's reserved plot would be a 4th, and my in-laws would make 6 spaces total, all owned by our family. This meant that of the original 12, there would be only 3 empty plots left not owned by us. And since another family member had been buried there in the interim, only 2 plots remained unclaimed, with 6 sitting empty and unusable. For some, this would be enough revenge, but my wife saw it as just the beginning. We set aside space on the family farmland to relocate the bodies in January of this year. It's a beautiful spot against tall pines with open fields leading up to it, plenty of room for those of us who wanted to be our final resting place. The only issue was that the path to access it was quite far. At my wife's suggestion, when planting season starts, my mother-in-law and her brother will ask their tenants to plow over the existing path and create a new one closer to our cemetery. Remember that this is the only access to the cousin's land, which is otherwise surrounded by trees on its frontage. We haven't told her about this plan and don't intend to. Hopefully, she finds out before the farmers show up to start planting. Despite her disgusting behavior through all of this, the cousin is a highly respected medical educator in the community. She is known to practically every nurse in the county. She even taught my wife in nursing school. But my wife is also well established and respected in the community, and she's making sure word is getting out about her cousin's behavior. It's a slow process, but as my wife says, that's often what wears stone down the best. Water is patient like that. It might take time, but once people know who you truly are, you can't change it. When the cousin discovers she can no longer access her property, and when her reputation begins to crumble as people learn how she treated a grieving widow and tried to disturb a man's final rest, she'll understand that some lines should never be crossed, especially when it comes to family. My older brother and I were raised by our grandparents after our parents passed away in a car accident when I was just 5 years old. He was 7 at the time. Our grandparents were hard-working people who poured their hearts and souls into the 80-acre farm that had been in the family for generations. I always loved the farm. I would wake up early to help Grandpa feed the animals before school. During summer breaks, I learned how to repair fences, maintain the tractor, and tend to the crops. My brother, on the other hand, hated farm life. He complained constantly about the chores, the early mornings, and the isolation from town. As soon as he turned 18, he left for the city and barely looked back, visiting only on major holidays and occasionally calling Grandma to ask for money. I stayed. I put my dreams of going to college on hold and helped our aging grandparents keep the farm running. When Grandpa's health started failing, I took over most of the physical labor. When Grandma developed arthritis, I learned to cook and help her with household tasks. I did all of this without complaint because I loved them and I loved our home. Last year, both of our grandparents passed away within months of each other. Grandpa went first and Grandma followed 3 months later. It was devastating. In their will, they left the farmhouse and 60 acres to me, with the remaining 20 acres and a sum of money going to my brother. Their reasoning was clear. I had devoted my life to helping them maintain the farm, while my brother had chosen a different path. When the will was read, my brother exploded. He couldn't believe that I was getting the lion's share, as he put it. He started shouting that everything should have been split equally between us. He accused me of manipulating our grandparents into giving me more. I defended myself, explaining that I didn't manipulate anyone and had stayed to help them for 15 years while he was gone. He argued back that it was my choice to be a farmer and that didn't mean I deserved more of the inheritance than him. I simply told him that Grandma and Grandpa had made their decision, and while I was sorry he was upset, this was what they wanted. That conversation happened at the lawyer's office. My brother stormed out, and I didn't hear from him for weeks. Then yesterday, he showed up at the farm unannounced. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard his car pull up. I went outside to meet him, hoping we could talk things through calmly. He was clearly drunk, his eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. Before I could even say hello, he started yelling. He demanded to know if I thought I could just take everything that should be his. He insisted that the farm should be half his and questioned who I thought I was. I tried to calm him down, suggesting we talk about this when he was sober. This only made him angrier. He called me a thief and accused me of being manipulative and taking advantage of two old people. I tried to reason with him, but he wasn't listening. He kept screaming and gesturing wildly. Then, without warning, he turned and stumbled toward the barn where Grandpa's old tractor was kept. I called after him, asking what he was doing and where he was going. He didn't answer. I followed him to the barn and watched as he climbed onto the tractor and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I yelled at him to get off the tractor, warning him that he was drunk and going to hurt himself. He shouted back that if he couldn't have the farmhouse, then neither could I. Before I could react, he put the tractor in gear and drove it straight toward the house. I ran after him, screaming for him to stop, but it was too late. The tractor smashed through the front porch, and then the entire front wall of the farmhouse gave way. As the structure began to collapse, my brother finally seemed to realize what he was doing and tried to jump off the tractor. But he wasn't fast enough. Part of the roof came down, catching him as he was halfway off the seat. The crash was deafening and dust filled the air. When it cleared enough for me to see, I found my brother pinned under a beam, barely conscious. Despite everything, he was still my brother. I called emergency services immediately, explaining what had happened. While waiting for the ambulance, I managed to remove some of the smaller debris from around him, but I couldn't lift the main beam that had him trapped. When the paramedics arrived, they asked what had happened. I explained that my brother had driven the tractor into the house during an argument and the structure had collapsed on him. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him before taking him to the hospital. One of them pulled me aside before they left and told me that my brother was in critical condition with internal bleeding and possible spinal injuries. They suggested I should come to the hospital. I followed the ambulance in my truck. As angry as I was, I didn't want my brother to die. At the hospital, I was directed to the waiting room while they rushed him into surgery. Hours passed before a doctor came out to speak with me. The doctor told me that my brother had survived the surgery, but his injuries were severe. He had multiple fractures, internal injuries, and there might be some paralysis. The doctor explained they wouldn't know the full extent until he regained consciousness. Now I'm sitting here in the hospital, trying to process everything. My home is partially destroyed. My brother is in critical condition, and somehow I'm the one who feels guilty. The police have already been by to take my statement. They've told me that my brother will likely face charges for destruction of property and reckless endangerment once he recovers enough. The irony is that fixing the farmhouse will probably cost most of what I would have inherited anyway, and my brother might never walk again, all because he couldn't accept that our grandparents had their reasons for dividing things the way they did. I guess there are no winners when it comes to inheritance disputes, only different degrees of losing. I hate traveling alone. My best friend had to cancel our trip to Miami at the last minute because her grandmother was in the hospital. I couldn't get a refund on my ticket, and I had already requested the time off work, so here I was dragging my carry-on through the crowded Atlanta airport on a Friday morning. The Transportation Security Administration line was moving at a snail's pace. I'd arrived 3 hours early for my flight, but it didn't seem to matter. Everyone was stressed, shuffling forward inch by inch, faces glued to their phones to avoid eye contact. I hadn't slept well the night before, nervous about traveling alone. I'm not great with crowds, but I was doing my best to stay calm by listening to a meditation podcast. The guy in front of me looked even more stressed than I felt. He wore an expensive business suit, constantly checking his watch and sighing loudly whenever the line stalled. He muttered something about the situation being ridiculous and questioned if the staff knew how to do their jobs. I kept my headphones in and pretended not to hear him. After about 45 minutes, we finally reached the security checkpoint. The businessman emptied his pockets into the plastic bin, tossing in his wallet, keys, phone, and wireless earbuds. He was rushing, clearly annoyed at the whole process. That's when I noticed one of his earbuds slip out of his hand and fall to the floor, sliding under the table where we were placing our bins. I tapped his shoulder to let him know. He spun around, his face twisted with anger, and shouted at me not to touch him, using an expletive for emphasis. Everyone around us went quiet. I felt my face burn with embarrassment. I tried to apologize, but he cut me off and told me to keep my hands to myself. The Transportation Security Administration agent gave me a sympathetic look and told me I could place my items in the bin. I noticed the earbud still lying under the table but decided against saying anything more. After going through security, I spotted the businessman patting his pockets with increasing panic. He pulled out his phone and one earbud, then frantically searched all his pockets again. He approached an agent and asked if he could go back through security to look for his missing earbud. The agent explained that he couldn't return without exiting and going through the entire process again. The businessman complained about the earbuds costing $200. I knew I should just walk past. He'd been incredibly rude, and he didn't deserve my help. But I couldn't resist the opportunity for a little karma. I approached him, keeping a respectful distance, and waited until he looked up at me. His face showed a mixture of recognition and annoyance. I told him I thought he had dropped an earbud back before the checkpoint. I wished him a great flight with a smile. His expression shifted from confusion to anger as he understood what I was saying. He couldn't go back without exiting security and starting all over again, which would take at least another hour. He demanded to know why I hadn't told him earlier. I smiled sweetly and explained that I had tried, but he had told me not to touch him, so I had respected his wishes. He got furious and demanded that I go back and get the earbud for him immediately. I apologized and said I had a flight to catch. I suggested he ask an agent for help instead. As he started to insult me, a supervisor who had been watching the exchange stepped forward. She asked if there was a problem. The businessman complained that I had seen him drop his earbud and hadn't told him. When asked for my side, I explained what had actually happened. The supervisor offered to call someone from Transportation Security Administration to look for the earbud but told him he needed to lower his voice and speak respectfully to other passengers. The businessman looked like he was about to explode but managed to contain himself. I headed to my gate while the supervisor radioed about the lost earbud. I don't know if he ever got it back, but I caught my flight to Miami and ordered a very delicious mojito once we were in the air. I'm a college student who works part-time at a local coffee shop. Between work, classes, and trying to have a social life, I'm always tired. Today was different though. I had the day off and spent it with friends at the mall. By evening, I was ready to head home. The bus stop was crowded, but I managed to get a seat. I put in my earbuds, turned on some lo-fi music, and closed my eyes for the 40-minute ride. 10 minutes in, someone sat beside me. I didn't pay attention until I heard loud music blasting. The guy next to me was scrolling through Instagram with his volume maxed out, disturbing everyone around us. His music was so loud it drowned out my earbuds. Other passengers looked annoyed, with elderly people wincing at the noise. After waiting for him to realize how disruptive he was being, I finally tapped his shoulder. I politely asked if he could turn down his volume since it was very loud. He barely looked at me, sizing me up with disdain. He rudely told me he didn't care about me, called me a little kid, and told me to mind my own business. I was stunned. I'm 21 years old, not a little kid, and asking for courtesy on public transport isn't unreasonable. Some passengers watched our interaction, but nobody stepped in. The guy returned to blasting his music. An older woman was covering her ears, and a teenager kept turning to glare at us. The bus driver either didn't notice or didn't care. That's when I decided to fight back. I pulled out my phone, opened Geometry Dash, a game with loud electronic music, turned my volume all the way up, removed my earbuds, and started playing a level with aggressive dubstep. The clash of his rap music and my game's electronic beats created chaos. People turned to look at us with horror, but I kept playing, pretending not to notice. The guy shifted uncomfortably and angrily asked what I thought I was doing. Without looking at him, I simply said I was playing my game and asked if there was a problem. He complained my music was too loud and demanded I turn it down. I finally faced him with a sweet smile and threw his own words back at him. I told him I didn't care about him, called him a little kid, and told him to mind his own business. His face turned red as he recognized his words. He huffed and lowered his volume slightly, but I kept my game blasting. After a few minutes, the combination was too much even for him. He turned his volume down to a reasonable level, but I maintained mine, determined to make my point. He asked more politely if I could please turn down the volume. I asked if my music was bothering him and remarked how annoying it must be when someone plays loud music in public without considering others. He glared but said nothing more. After a few more minutes of my Geometry Dash soundtrack, he stood up and announced it was his stop. I knew it wasn't really his stop. We were nowhere near any residential areas. He pushed past me and yelled at the driver to let him out. The bus stopped and he stormed off, glaring at me one last time. As soon as he was gone, I turned off my game and returned to my peaceful, lo-fi playlist. An elderly woman gave me a thumbs up and a teenager nodded in appreciation. I just smiled and enjoyed the rest of my quiet ride home. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.